So many people in this room for this meeting. So we are talking about the Article 15 accessory dwelling units. The Arlington Redevelopment Board requested that the residential study group take a look at this article. They also, at the same time, filed it on the warrant for town meeting. The hearing on it is on the 25th.
Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's on the 25th,
yes.
right?
Yep.
And so far, the Housing Plan Implementation Committee did have a conversation about it at their meeting, and they also had some thoughts about the bylaw as it was written. We can share that today. We've shared, I think, the draft of the bylaw. We shared some materials with the group about from the Pioneer Institute report. And then I think Winnell Evans also distributed some other information that was via Erin, and she has some additional materials today. And then I believe Liz also has some materials to share. Did I miss anything? Is there any other sharing that occurred?
I don't think so. And Mary's going to be bringing in Winnell's table.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just shared a conversation with with Chief Jefferson, who has a lot of concerns and wants to be brought in on this conversation as fast as possible. If you're planning on going ahead this year with this,
Okay. Who is this, Mike?
the fire chief.
The fire chief. Oh, fire chief. Thank you. Okay. So can I hand these out?
Yeah.
I actually used the Pioneer Institute as a resource when I investigated communities that allow accessory dwelling units. But last night I thought, well, wait a minute, who funds these people? So I did a little bit of research into them, and they're not necessarily the nonpartisan institute that their mission statement claims. They do have a slant, as everybody does, and I just thought it was worthwhile that we know this before. I think their info on who does and doesn't allow an accessory dwelling unit is obviously unimpeachable, but their maybe rationale or supporting information, I think we should take with a grain of salt based on their other policy initiatives, their funding sources, et cetera, et cetera. If you could.
Sure.
They're funded by the Koch brothers.
Among others.
Among others.
Among others.
And they certainly have an agenda.
Yeah, very much so. So I just think it's something worthwhile keeping in mind if indeed we use them as a kind of supporter of allowing accessory dwelling units.
Oh, I think I have more than one of these.
Okay. Do you need the comparative chart?
All right, so why don't we, thank you, Winnell. Why don't we just get into the discussion about the article as it's drafted at this point? I think that would be helpful. Liz, do you want to share something?
Sure. No, I'm happy to. I'd like to lead off the discussion.
Yep, okay.
If we're ready to do that.
I think so.
Okay. Let's see. So I prepared some remarks today, a list of concerns that I have about this article. And one of the things that we have gone over again and again in this group is how do the changes that are proposed, how do they have greater impacts beyond what was initially intended? What are the potential unintended consequences of a new proposal? And that is something that we come back to again and again. And I have some very serious concerns about this article and this proposal for accessory dwelling units. First, because of the potential for abuse by Airbnb and similar short-term rental stays. And then second, I think it's going to have the effect that it will lead to more teardowns in the community by making single-family housing vulnerable to rebuilds for two-family with an accessory structure. So first, I'd like to go through why I'm concerned about Airbnb use. I think that a private accessory dwelling unit with its own separate entrance and kitchen facilities would be attractive as a short-term rental unit on Airbnb or similar sites, particularly given Arlington's proximity to Boston and the T. And I'm very concerned about that because one of the attractive things about living in Arlington is that we have a cohesive, stable neighborhood where you know your neighbors and the people that live around you. and that suddenly if you introduce a hotel-like population with people coming in and out all the time, you're going to fundamentally change the character of the single-family residential districts in a way that upsets the settled expectations of people who bought single-family units. And even if this were limited to 90 days, as the legislation proposes, when you buy a single-family house, you don't think that there's going to be a 90-day turnover of different people coming in and out in your neighborhood, as you would maybe if you lived in an apartment complex. And I feel like this is going to fundamentally change the character of the R1 district, and that for that reason alone, it should not be allowed. Also, as a parent of young children, I think it's very worrisome to have a situation where you don't know and have no way of tracing who is in your neighborhood coming in and out. And it would, as a parent, I would have second thoughts about having my children play in my yard if I didn't know who was going to be around and there was no way to identify where they were coming from, and they have access to the backyard and that kind of thing. So I think that opens up a can of worms. I'm concerned that this proposal doesn't address parking at all, and you're going to have twice the demand for parking, but no provision that additional spaces are required, and that this is going to have the unintended consequence of putting pressure to overturn the overnight parking ban, which our community has upheld time and time again, and that's a significant potential unintended consequence that has not been addressed. The research, and then another point is that I'm concerned that allowing accessory dwelling units will cause rents to go up in the entire community because of the Airbnb use, making rents less affordable for year-round residents. And I have two newspaper articles that I found just doing a quick search on it, but this phenomenon is well documented, and I'll pass some of these around and I'll also distribute them to you. But these are newspaper articles that say that in a 2016 study by the University of Massachusetts found that areas in Boston with the most Airbnb listings had higher rents by an average of $93 a month. And that is because if a community facilitates Airbnb listings, landlords realize that they will make more money doing short-term Airbnb listings rather than renting long-term for-year leases to people who actually live in the community. And then that cuts down on the supply, and then the rents go up for the remaining properties, or in order to match the Airbnb rate, people raise rents anyway. And so this proposal could have a negative effect on affordability in the community, and I think that needs to be really studied a lot more to make sure that we're not creating more of an affordable housing crisis by this problem rather than less of a crisis. And I will distribute these articles around. And this is not just in the Boston area. New York City has had a terrible problem with properties being taken off the market for year-round residential use because of Airbnb. Finally, with the Airbnb issue, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to enforce this accessory dwelling unit provision to make sure that it's not being used for Airbnb. And I know that Inspectional Services is already to the max with their enforcement, and there's no provision in here for extra funding for them, extra manpower, and how would such enforcement work? Would Inspectional Services have to patrol websites to make sure that units are not being rented? Would they conduct spot checks? How often would those spot checks be? How difficult would it be to even conduct a spot check on a 90-day rental period lease? Where would the funding be for this increased manpower for Inspectional Services? Are you going to rely on neighbors to rat each other out if they think it's being used for Airbnb? And what kind of negative consequences does that have for the whole community? Also, what's the penalty if people are renting it out for Airbnb? They lose their license? They have to sign an affidavit saying they're going to attest to the 90-day rental period. Well, what happens if they don't agree? It sounds like nothing so far, and I don't think that that's appropriate. The second reason that I think this is a problem is because I think that it will make teardowns more likely in the residential districts. And we've learned on this group that the area with the greatest pressure for tear downs are single-family houses located in the two-family zones. And accessory dwelling units will essentially convert all single families into a two-family, creating pressure on smaller single-family homes to buy it, knock it down, build a bigger house on the assumption that they can then go and get a permit later for an accessory dwelling unit. I don't
Can I
think...
just ask a quick question?
Yes.
Because we want to have a discussion about it, and
Yeah.
I see
Yeah.
there's a whole new page of
All right, let me...
Kinda not fair.
I was like,
to be
whoa,
honest.
wow.
No, I have...
I know you have a lot
let
to
me,
say,
Let me get
but-
it out, and
and I will-
I'll speed it up, okay?
Okay, if you don't mind, that would be
No,
great, because I
and-
think we're in 7 minutes here.
Okay,
Okay.
all right. I will.
I'm
I
not a
will.
moderator,
I will
An
get
official
going
one
on
anyway,
it.
but
I think I can.
yes.
I think I can wrap it up in like a minute or two.
That would be
Okay.
appreciated,
Good.
just so we can
That's
have
fine.
and people may want to
Yes.
comment on the things that you're raising,
Yes.
I'm sure.
Yes, I'm sure. I would propose that there should be some kind of language that the accessory dwelling unit must be within the envelope of the house as it existed on a certain date, probably January 1st of this year, or alternatively, cannot exceed a percentage of the net floor area of the dwelling as it existed on January 1st. But that discussion has not been had in here, and that needs to be really fleshed out further. And I don't think having the square footage be as of the permit application is sufficient, because people will buy a property, knock it down, build a huge house, anticipating that they'll get their permit later, and you're going to facilitate a larger house construction on the hope that they will get a permit down the line. Now, in the course of my professional legal work, I came across Nantucket, which has accessory dwelling units and a lot stricter protections in their regulations than are being proposed here. One of the things that they have is they restrict occupancy to a year-round household, not 90 days. They have restrictions on what it means to be owner-occupied, with the definition that says that it cannot be by a condominium, cooperative housing corporation, land trust, or other common interest ownership entity in which there's a separate beneficial ownership, to avoid speculative corporations coming in and buying this and leasing out. And there's no discussion here about what it means to be an owner. Can a condominium association be an owner? Can a corporation be an owner?
Well,
So
we can resolve
we
that.
can resolve that. But even if some of these situations are addressed, I don't think that this proposal should go forward because of, first and foremost, the difficulties with enforcement and the negative impact that it's going to have on the character of the single-family district.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Liz, and thanks for being so thorough,
I'll be
as always.
brief. Liz
And then
covered
Jonathan.
a lot of the comments that I want to make, so that's great. I do want to just get one thing on the record, and I hope not to sound churlish, because I don't mean it that way. But I'm very concerned that this issue is coming to us last. It has so far been discussed by the Zoning Bylaw Working Group, by the Housing Plan Implementation Committee, and by the ARB. And of those groups, we are the only one which has been directed solely to study the effects of development in established neighborhoods, which this certainly qualifies as. So I just want to get that on the record that I'm concerned about that. Along with that, we also have our own article to prepare for town meeting. We need to prepare a presentation. Apparently this was already presented to the ARB, which we didn't know about,
What was?
the design guidelines amendment.
Just that we were filing something.
Just to
That's
mention,
all.
but I think we need to sell it as we have done in past years, and we have our own article to prepare, and now we have
We
to
can talk about that
to
if you
study.
wanna
But,
actually
but I'm just,
understand that.
we've
It's
kind of
a-
got competing goals here.
Okay.
Liz said a lot of what I would. I want to say that I think my primary concern about this is that it is in contradiction to our current zoning bylaws. The statement of intent for the R0 through 1 district says the town discourages intensive land uses that would detract from the single-family residential character of these neighborhoods and uses that would otherwise interfere with the intent of the bylaw. And in a nod to Steve McKenna, of everything we have discussed in this group so far, this amendment has the greatest potential for unintended consequences, I feel. I think enforcement is an enormous issue on many, many levels. And I think that, you know, we get into all kinds of code issues. Many of these houses are very old, and suddenly somebody's going to be adding, a kitchen, a bathroom. You know, does the electrical have to be brought up to code? There are just so many issues that this opens, and I think it's premature for this to be up for a vote in essentially 6 weeks. I don't see how we study this in 6 weeks and come to an informed consensus. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay. Thanks, Mel. Jonathan?
I agree with many of Liz's points, and I appreciate her mentioning them. But I also feel there's a bit of a tone of sort of fear-mongering in what you had to say. And it concerns me because it seems like so many times we take the smallest possible thing and we make it like everybody's going to have Airbnb. There's already Airbnb in Arlington, plenty of it. You know, it's so. I think with 11,000 building units in Arlington, there might be 5, there might be 15. Even with regards to knockdowns, we always talk about it like, 500 houses are being knocked down. It's just not true. We've researched other towns. We've researched Newton. What were the other ones, Winnell?
Well,
Is it Watertown?
Yeah.
And they've said they've passed these, and they get 5 people a year, 6 people a
Watertown
year.
pulled back, though, don't forget.
Okay, but I'm just saying, it's just
It was
one
repealed
of
in
the...
92.
Yeah. So I just think,
Wow.
I think that life in Arlington is subject to change. Can we make some good changes? Can we try some things? And if it doesn't work 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, there are systems like Cambridge has had to tweak their Airbnb thing. So there's other towns, and I think by coming at it as just worst case scenario fearful, I think it's going to penalize us in the long run. Anyway, real quick questions. I don't think the parking issue is an issue because you only have so much driveway and that's all you can fit in, period. A lot of people don't even have cars. So we're also talking about people that are potentially walking to the T, etc. The single family and a 2-family zone, they're by right knocked down to a legal 2-family. So I don't understand how the 2-family, the single family.
This is not for the 2-family districts. I think that what would happen is that you're going to put pressure on single families in single family zones to knock those down and build bigger units that can have an income apartment in it.
But I disagree with that.
And John just finished his...
Yeah, so anyway, I disagree with that point because we don't have that many. Anyway, and then my other concern, only because I see it with neighbors in my neighborhood, extended family. So you're just bringing out Airbnb. There's extended family that needs some sort of accommodation. They have to move, they have to sell their property. They can't coexist with family unless they have some of these options. And also caretakers. As some of us get older, we need caretaker aspects. The way I read what we're talking about, it's something within the footprint of the property that's already there. So we're not creating extra space, etc. And I think, again, things are subject to change. Maybe we're talking about something that's built in 10 years. Again, I think it's such a small percentage of all the housing. I think concerns are good, but don't let possible positive change be killed because of 1 or 2 extremes. That's my point.
I think
Bill,
we should...
Mike?
No, I thought we were going to go around the table.
Oh, okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, I just had just a few observations here that, if this discussion is going to continue, I thought we should look at a few different things. As Jonathan mentioned, we should be looking at what some of the other towns have done. I see like Lexington and Belmont, are allowing them. It'd be interesting to see, how many permits are actually pulled for those over like the last 3 years, so we have a sense of what the numbers really are, and and based on that, what the impact is going to be.
Do note that their minimum lot sizes, though, are quite a bit larger than ours.
Yeah,
It's also by special permit.
but still, I mean, and I think it's great that it's all done by special permit. I think a couple of the other issues are certainly the 90 days and all of that. Why aren't we looking at 9 to 12 month minimums?
Right.
Then it's a true rental unit if we're gonna allow that. And these temporary absences. I mean, you're saying 3 months in a 5-year period. I mean, what happens to the lucky snowbirds that head up to Florida for 3 months? They're knocked out. I mean, I think some of the benefits of this, would come into play, and I'm not advocating for this at this point, but, you know, I think it could certainly allow, you know, some seniors to be able to stay in their homes, you know, have their extended families come in. It, you know, may help with affordable housing if, you know, if we're talking, you know, annual rental periods instead of 90 days. I mean, I'm definitely not in favor of, you know, 90-day periods. I mean, I just don't think that works, and for a lot of the reasons you mentioned, it's, you know, I would definitely not be in favor of that, but, you know, I think, again, the upside, you know, it may help some seniors, and it may help with some affordable housing. But, you know, are we gonna be able to hash this all out before town meeting? I don't think so. That's my 2 cents.
Any other?
I think Steve, you next?
I'll let the
Oh, okay.
committee, the group talk first.
Mike or Pat?
Go ahead, Ben. Well, I'm not, I think that this is a relatively small proposal rather than a relatively big proposal. That other communities in this area, not just the ones that Winnell has pointed out, but all of the others that were in the the Pioneer Report, what they come up with is somewhere between 0, 1, 2. What the report hopes for is maybe that could be got up to 5, but resident restricted ones are now at basically 1.
I'm sorry, Pat, could you please speak up? I can't hear a word you're saying.
Okay, let me try again. I think it's a smaller proposal than we've been talking about. That others who have similar proposals with often similar restrictions, some of them more restrictive than this, and some more and some less in different dimensions, are not producing a lot of a lot of applications at all. And even when it's done by right, there are not very many. So I don't think that the notion that we will achieve that some disaster is likely to happen in the short term is very realistic. That doesn't mean that there aren't perfectly legitimate concerns. I think the idea of not making sure that this doesn't become an Airbnb sort of issue is an important concern. Their attempt was to address it by adding the 90-day provision. I think 9 to 12 months would be better. I mean, ultimately what we're looking for is not sort of transient housing or even medium-term corporate housing for when people come here to do trials and stuff, but looking for an actual addition to the housing stock of the community, and something longer than that, longer than 90 days seems appropriate. I think that the parking is potentially a problem and will certainly be perceived as a problem. And our provision here is has a bigger, is less restrictive on parking than most others in this area. It's like Newton, but Newton is sort of almost outlier now for the number, for minimizing parking. There is a model for the state which proposes 1 parking space rather than 2. And certainly rather than 0. And the way I read this, it almost prevents any parking conditions from being put on as part of the other responsibilities of the ZBA if it's thought that's necessary in order for neighborhood compatibility. What if you go into an area that already has a significant parking problem, and this has the potential of adding to it? So the way this language is written, it almost takes away an authority that already exists to provide parking requirements. I personally think that the owner occupancy requirements are much too restrictive. I figured out if you take 3 months over the course of 5 years, you're talking basically 18 days a year being away. And then what happens when I go down to to take care of my grandchildren in Washington, but I leave my wife here and then she goes later? Does that count as our being away, or does that count as our being there? There's some technical things that go into that. What happens when your primary residence is of one person but not another? It's often that old people like me have joint arrangements with children and jointly own their houses. One person lives in the house, one person doesn't. How does that work out? Does the person who isn't in there going to be counted? Is that going to disqualify him because it's not that person's primary residence? And in fact, the very concept of private residence is not really spelled out for this context. So I think that a certain amount of work needs to be. I go much further towards the model, which has just the bona fide temporary absences. But Lexington has a much bigger thing. If you're transferred in the military abroad and you need to be away for 2 years, you can actually rent both of them during that period of time. That may very well be something you'd want to do. Or you may want to, for example, be in a situation where somebody works for a foreign company and is going to the headquarters of that company, as my son-in-law once was in a position to do. He'd be gone for 2 years, planning to come back to his house, but suddenly a granny flat wouldn't work. An additional question has to do with residential restriction. Some aspects of this, some purposes for this, depend upon wanting to have freely rentable properties in the community, and that would probably involve a certain degree of pressure on affordable housing, and maybe helpful or harmful. I think it would be helpful. But there are also other things like giving people an opportunity to bring caretakers in or extended family. Sometimes old people like me might want to move into the affordable unit, the accessory unit, and let their children occupy the other. Many people, unfortunately, unlike me now, have their children coming back and they want to know where to put them. And the idea, if my wife had to share her kitchen with any of my children, it would be a major mental health problem for everybody concerned. So there's lots of stuff that's going on here and not much time to figure it out. I do think that we are not giving adequate weight to the language which I understand it saying that the lead-in is that the Zoning Board of Appeals may grant a special permit for an accessory dwelling unit and a single-family dwelling in the R0 or R1 districts existing as of February 14th, 2019. And I think that was intended to prevent the tear-down problem. That is to say, if it's torn down in the future, it isn't included in here.
That doesn't, I don't think, say that. I think it's the district as existing, not
Well,
the house
that's
as
the question
existing.
that I want to
No,
ask.
it's meant to be the house.
Well,
yeah.
that's
meant
not
to
how
be
it's
the-
written.
Okay.
So I think that should be made clearer. There is an effort to address that issue. Maybe that's the right way to do it. Maybe it's not. It has its own problems because those houses will get older and older with time, but also town meeting is going to continue to sit for a long time too. So I don't really think the tear down is a big issue here, and if it were an issue, we could address that. The point is that at this point we have, largely thanks to this long oration, we have about 25 minutes left before the end of the meeting to decide what to do, or we have to figure out a schedule of further meetings to figure all that out. And there are a lot of issues, and there are a lot of potentials. And even if I'm wrong, and it turns out that in the future that this is a bigger problem, and Liz is more nearly right than I am, we still don't have the time to actually to do very much about that, and not all of it can be addressed. I do think that if things go forward, that serious consideration ought to be given to requiring a study of the consequences of this at the same time. It's much too easy to just sort of do it, assuming that this or that is going to be the consequence, and then you never follow up. And you don't look, I mean, you can see this in the report where lots of times the planners in answering the Pioneer Institute questions, the answer is essentially, I have no clue. And so it would be useful to know exactly what the questions are, a schedule to begin with that town meeting could see, at least as this is the minimum, and possibly working some information gathering requirements in here in order to be able to follow up, and with the thought that this will come back. I mean, ideally, I'd sunset it if we went ahead, and unless it was reauthorized. And remember that study could lead to expanding it. We might discover that there isn't a problem, and that much of these fears are just fears, and that maybe we ought to consider being able to do this for garages or whatever. Or some restrictions may seem unnecessary or whatever. the point is that a study could go either way. But the important thing would be to use the experience, if we proceed, in order to gather the information to do anything further, whether it's cutting back or expanding, based upon some knowledge that we don't already have. And finally, I completely share the enforcement concerns. I don't see how that's going to be done. It's a budgetary thing. I don't see how it's going to be paid for. And I think that, in fairness, people who are concerned about this, whether legitimately or not, I'm not saying legitimately, whether accurately or not, have a right to understand how this is all going to happen. And otherwise, it's just words on paper, and it won't persuade anyone at town meeting or anybody in the community that this is benign for them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
Well, I agree with a lot of that, and I just feel like the time is short,
Yeah.
and it feels like the ARB meeting isn't even until the 25th, so the input, I just feel like there's enough time this year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, Winnie. For us, like I said, I spoke with Chief Jefferson this morning. He hadn't even heard of this, which really gives a lot of concern. Because when we do plan review, the first thing we think of is how firefighters handle these situations when they go in these buildings. And this is going to bring a whole new dynamic to firefighting, to not knowing where these accessories are. They're not going to know. That I think is what I mostly get out of his conversation. For us, for me, it's a little more difficult because I have my own personal opinions, which I keep to myself. But for the building, for our department, enforcement is not only difficult, I'm going to tell you right now, it's impossible. It's not going to be enforced. The last three things that we had, this week we had a home in East Arlington. 20 people living on floors, mattresses, 4 people living on a concrete floor, on a cinder block. And so I think you see where the consequences might be heading, Pat. You know, that is sort of where, and when the owner was confronted with this, she had two answers immediately. And both of them were exactly what we're talking about. Oh, these accessory apartments, and the other is, no, this is Airbnbs. I mean, first of all, neither of them are allowed at this point in this town. So I think we can also see where these things have been heading already. We were dealing with another one. And so it's kind of contrary to our business model, because we issue permits, but we got to do them right. And we have another family living in a garage up the heights in there. The very first time I was even told about Airbnbs was years ago. It was up by Wollaston Ave, and it was an old garage, cinder block. They finished off inside beautifully. It was a ladder going up through the garage, and it was the bathroom was inside the house, so they'd have to crawl down the ladder and over. So I'm not saying that's that's what these people were doing. I can't say is what's going to happen, but I have to look at that as enforcement. And the other part of enforcement is we have to deal with plain sight doctrine. That's what it's called. And if I can't see it from the sidewalk, and if I'm not invited on, and I don't have a search warrant from a judge, I can't go on that property. And there's a lot of lawyers in this room. Does anyone know a judge that's going to give me a search warrant because of something like this? And I mean, I feel bad saying all this stuff, but it's reality for what we have to deal with, and it's hard enough keeping up with, a lot of public record requests, so refrain from other. But we're dealing with 25, 30 public record requests a week. It's just on top of everything. I mean, this would obviously go above that, but it's everything seems like everything's being thrown at the building department. I mean, and then some. This is something that I am deathly afraid of. If anyone wants to sign off on this, I think you're signing death warrants for a lot of people potentially in this town. And you can say fear-mongering, Jonathan. It's the truth. If you saw this house we went into, you'd be amazed they're even alive. And we won't even get into the conditions that the illegal human trafficking they're living in this town. Fortunately, I think we've got rid of all the ones we know of, and we have even thoughts of. But we're safety in things. I don't care if we decide to build 12-story apartment buildings in R1, that's fine. I have to enforce it. Where does that come in? And, you know, I know it doesn't fit into everyone's point of view here, but that is kind of how I have to look at it, and I apologize if I offended people's feelings or not, but that's the reality of this. And I mean, it couldn't be any more real than Mike was down there the other day, down East Arlington, and it was sad. This padlocks, deadbolts, imagine everything, unimagine everything went on in this place, and the owner didn't care. And that's not the only one like that. I'll leave it at that, because I could go on for hours on this subject.
Did you want to?
No. I'm good.
You want to follow that?
No, I'm good. You're trying to set it off. Yeah.
Going around the room here.
Yeah.
All right, Steve?
Jenny?
Yes.
Yeah. So I appreciate that. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to start by saying that I respect what everybody has had to say today, because I think everybody has brought up important issues, important concerns, and things that need to be considered. And I agree that we probably can't consider all of these in a timely manner to get it approved for this town meeting. I spent a lot of time talking with Jenny, with Michael. I'm glad Mike spoke with the fire department. I was trying to speak with them. I've talked to the Greater Boston Real Estate Board. I've talked with neighbors, and I've talked with clients over the last 2 to 3 weeks. I think one of the most important things up front is that we need to be sensitive and respectful of all of our neighbors, and especially the fact that most people who bought these homes bought them in a single-family neighborhood and are not looking for the neighborhood, the characteristics of the neighborhood to change greatly. With that said, my biggest concern is that it is causing a burdensome to the building department, and I think there's ways that we will have to try to help them. To Liz's point, how do they have a budget for it? So are there fee structures that we can set up for this? Are there fines that we can impose for this? But I think one of the most important things is I want to personalize this for everybody, because I think it's critical. I don't think the Koch brothers are going to be here in Arlington checking to see what we do. And I don't think they're having any persuasion on what we're making decisions here. I don't think any of these single-family homes are going to be turned into hotels. As Michael said, we have regulations. We have rules and regulations, zoning bylaws in the town of Arlington that need to be enforced. And they are such that we don't allow Airbnbs, period. To Liz's point, she says, are we going to run into a situation where neighbors are ratting on each other? Well, unfortunately, Liz, that's what's been happening for years, and that's how the building department receives a lot of notification that someone's doing something that they shouldn't. So nothing is going to change in that manner. But what I think we truly honestly have to look at, and I'm going to be very specific, that I, along with Billy and Jonathan, and possibly the building department, we are in more houses than anybody every single year. I meet with clients constantly, and specifically, I have not just one, but I'm going to talk specifically one client. Right now, I have an elderly woman that her husband has passed away. She has a 2,800 square foot home that she does not want to leave, but she needs now her daughter and her daughter's family to move in with her and take care of her. But as Pat said, there's no way that they can cohabitate with one kitchen. So she is now forced to sell the home that she loves instead of moving her family in there and buying a 2-family in Arlington. The additions that we're talking about, based upon some of the regulations proposed, is no larger than a 750 square foot addition, which we already allow. But what we're saying is, if you're building a 750 square foot addition with an additional kitchen, you need a special permit. And that special permit is going to be, I think, very restrictive, that it's going to involve the building department, the fire department, the planning department, neighbors, and it's going to be looked at. But we have an elderly community that does not want to leave their homes. And either they have the ability of renovating their home with family assistance, or they have their own money to generate an opportunity to be taken care of, whether it's by family or by a caregiver. And we have an obligation to these citizens to protect them, as Mike said, to make sure that they're safe, and to give them an opportunity to live the quality of life that they want to have. And I don't think we should remove that so quickly without spending some time and energy and effort to looking upon that. I believe some of these opportunities are that we set in guidelines, and there's very specific guidelines for a non-rental ADU that's being occupied by a family unit versus a rental ADU. Now, again, this is putting and imposing a lot of burdens on Mike, and we have to talk about that. But there are opportunities that we could help the citizens of the town. I do not want to see investment seekers coming in, buying a single-family home, renting out that major portion of the house and putting addition on and leaving. No, there's ways to set up guidelines and protection for that, whether it's through community involvement, whether it's through the departments that we have that are involved in doing that. But I feel this is such a major lifestyle decision that we are making for some of the most important people in our community that have lived here twice as long as many of us, and they want to continue living here. Whether it's by putting a small addition on the house that they can get some income to stay there and pay for the taxes that are now going to be increasing because of all of the effects and changes in the town of Arlington, or that they want to have the opportunity to have the family move in. And I'll just give you one example of how we change it from the guidelines for a non-rental ADU to a rental ADU. I believe that if a person is allowed to put an addition on their home for an ADU, that they have to occupy the main house, the large portion of the house, if they are renting out the ADU. But if it's an older woman that is bringing her family in and she's going to occupy the smaller unit and her family's taking over the unit, great. But I don't want to see the neighborhood change where someone puts an addition on their home who was proposing this down by Mystic Lakes a few years ago, that Mike would remember, and he was going to move into the smaller unit and rent out his house. Well, if I'm a neighbor, I don't want that house rented out to 4 college kids or 4 people that are unknown to one another. So there are guidelines we can set in place for how it has to be owner-occupied, how it can't be rented. If it is being used by a family member and they want to change it to a rental unit, special permits required again. There's all guidelines that we can set forth. We are an intelligent group. Mike said we have attorneys there. We are very smart, caring people. And this is something we need to look at in a whole, and not just in a part, but it's going to be Airbnb. I'm here in Miami Beach right now. Miami Beach does not allow Airbnb. Downtown Miami does. Miami Beach has a full code enforcement officer. That's all they do. So is that what Arlington is going to have to do? Then it's a budget issue. But all of this cannot be placed upon just the building department, and then again we have to talk to the fire department. I'm in favor of some form of ADU to help out our citizens, and I think everybody on our committee should see it that way. It's not going to be developers coming in, building huge houses, putting huge additions on, and then leaving and it's going to be rented out. There's a way of controlling this, and I think you need to look at who our neighbors are, who our town meeting members are, and how we can take care of these people.
Okay,
That's my soapbox for
Thank
today.
you, Steve.
Thank you.
Jonathan, did you have your hand up before, and then Liz?
Well, no, I just wanted to just ask Mike quickly, how many of these situations do you see a year, like basically the flop house?
Do
And
we
because they
see
have
the-
them, but I'm just saying sometimes the exception gets all the media, not just say, but in general, the exception gets all the media, and then, that's a horrible situation. I agree.
It's not an easy 3, 4, 5 situation. Do where we get to the point of this week, maybe 4 or 5 a year? Do we get to a point where I think that we have been at this long enough that a telephone call can generally resolve a lot of these issues, and I hope that's one of our bigger assets that we have. But that doesn't mean that there isn't another 20 or 25 of these going on, or attempting to go on. As far as enforcement goes, I mean, I know everyone's writing enforcement. I'm not going to lie. People know me. I don't lie. There isn't going to be enforcement. I can't enter the properties. If you're violating this bylaw, you're not going to let me in. Let's just face it. I mean, what's going to happen is the people that are in this for the right reason and want to do it for the right reason, they're going to do it the right way. But with the other vast majority are going to abuse it, and it's going to be hopefully not tragic.
And then just following up on what you just said, I think, and maybe I'm different. I think that's one of our responsibilities as neighbors in neighborhoods is to be there to help people, but also you have to. You keep an eye on your neighborhood. You have kids, like if there's an odd person in our neighborhood, we call the police. So it is a part of it. That's because of budget, et cetera. You just don't have the reality.
It's not even
You have
budget.
to-
You could give us 100. You could give us 100 guys. We could.
No, I know.
It's
I know, but I'm just
it's
saying
the
that-
legal aspect of it. Very,
can't-
very
That's
quick,
neighbors.
very
Right.
quick rebuttal.
Right.
I don't think it's my right or my responsibility to police my neighbors.
Well, then don't.
Well,
Just don't do it. Then.
That's right.
But how do you
Don't do it.
how do you police your neighbors if you don't know who's supposed to be there or not? Because
Yeah.
you
But you don't know
have
it.
constant Airbnb rentals.
But we have no authority until a formal complaint's been filed, so if there's no
Yeah.
complaint filed, then we
Right.
can't do anything.
So it has to come from an
Even if the complaint is filed, it still
It's
legally
still a
can't go in
process.
there.
Right, it's
Yeah.
still,
Okay,
it's
Okay, we
still
send
a
out a
process.
letter. If that owner isn't going to
Circular.
say, okay, we'll meet you there Thursday at 10,
No.
Yeah.
or they say,
Liz wants
see you
to.
never.
Okay.
Well, they have
jump in.
30
I
days
think
to
this is
reply.
like, we're also like,
Yeah,
I
we're
think
running
now
late, I
we're
know.
running
But
on.
can't
So
force it,
I
can't force
think
it.
this has been a really valuable discussion,
Absolutely.
raising all of the potential issues, problems, consequences, benefits, drawbacks of this article. And what this tells me is that this article is not ready for prime time. And if we want to, if the town wants to pursue accessory dwelling units in the future, it should be after a process with stakeholders where the language can be fleshed out, where the intent can be fleshed out. And Steve, I hear what you're saying. It would be great if you could have this be just for family members, but that's not what this is. And if you could balance that with the concerns of the fire department, and who knows what that, maybe it's first floor only, no basements, so they don't have to worry about going into a basement in a single family district. But these are a lot of issues that the town should have a thorough vetting of. And I think that we make a recommendation to the ARB now that says we've identified numerous potential, drawbacks, unintended consequences, needs for modification, and that we recommend further study and that you withdraw the article for this year.
Yeah. Pat?
I agree.
I'd like to say I agree with that.
I think
Yeah.
we can
I
vote on
don't.
it.
I think there are two. One is that even if we took 6 weeks and tried working through all of these issues, it would be difficult, and we don't have a process that easily lends itself to that. And second is that just hearing what's going on around the table and noticing all of the recording that's being done and so forth, this is something that's going to require a certain amount of interest at town meeting and in the community. And in fairness, I think that if any steps along this way, no matter how they're controlled, how we deal with enforcement issues and so forth, how we deal with incipient Airbnb issues, which are sort of nodding their head, but that's only part of it. There's a big part that isn't part of ADUs at all. Those are all things that need to be addressed after a conversation and a process where we can hear from people, where we can maybe winnow things down. We can hear from folks who want granny flats or kitty flats or whatever, and figure out the thing that best fits Arlington. And I think that it's too late in the year to do that. We can't do that between now and town meeting, and we don't need in a meeting. It's a long set of warrant articles with a lot of controversial stuff on it. I don't think we need to add this, which is sort of half-baked at this point, notwithstanding all the effort that's gone into it so far, to just add to the confusion and the divisiveness that I foresee happening anyway. So I agree with Liz. I think that we should just say we've seen a lot of problems and potential problems. We need to have a bigger process and so forth, and the ARB should recommend no action on this article, and we, without prejudice to being able to come back to it after we've given it more thorough study.
Okay.
So
Any
Pat,
other-
what you're saying is that if we kick it out, then is this something that we're going to suggest that it is brought back to the RSG, and as we have done in the past, we then vet everything out over a period of time and then make a proposal or a new bylaw to the ARB, either in a special town meeting or next year's town meeting?
I think that we should be involved, but I'm not 100% sure that we're the right agency to organize the degree of public participation that I think is necessary to build confidence in whatever it is that happens.
You need to have the fire chief.
There needs to be lots more more into it, some other kind of task force of which I think that we should have representation. But there are a lot of other interests that are involved, and ways of interacting with the public that we are not familiar with, and so I think it's a bigger process than something that we can just do under our own authority.
All right, any other comments on this? If not at the table, then anybody else want to comment?
I'd like to. I'm Carl Wagner.
Sure.
I live in Edge Hill Road. I grew up here. I moved away. I came back. It's a great place to live. I just wanted to say very briefly that when people move into a single-family zone or two-family zone or whatever, I think there's a kind of like social contract or maybe even almost a contract assumed that you're moving into that zone and you're agreeing not to build 4 units or that your neighbor will build 2 units if it's a 1-unit area. And we have to be aware that neighbors who are surrounded by either a new mansion or a tear down that is obnoxious are kind of offended by that, as much as we have to be aware of elderly people or others who, for whatever reason, need to have more people living in their house. And I wanted to point out to anybody watching this on this thing or around the table that you can effectively have people living in your house today. Not 20, like the building inspector said, but you can have people living there. I think that the rules are basically you just don't have to have a kitchen area or something like that. So we already allow a lot of flexibility for Arlingtonians, and we should. It's very important. Another point I wanted to make as a town meeting member for many years is the town meeting has resolved several times. Twice, I believe, in Jenny's at the last 8 years or so.
It was 2012, and then it followed in 2013.
Yeah, so I erroneously earlier had said in 5 years. But in any case, this would be 3 times in 10 years if it were brought up again. Please respect the representatives of the 43,000 people here, the town meeting members who said, don't do this, don't bring it to us. I do want to commend this meeting. It's the first intelligent review of this article I've heard. The proponents seem to be pushing it rather than having from the bottom, from the grassroots, from the people who pay the taxes, the businesses and residents, perspective on how to do this. I don't think Arlington should ever have to take rules from Metro Boston, Metro mayors, CHAPA, etc. And that's basically what I fear has been happening here. I support exactly what you're doing, even the comments from the developer side or from the realtor side. But a discussion of the people who pay the taxes and live here and work here is very important, so thank you.
Just to clarify one thing before I accept any further comment, and actually we're at like 2, 3 of, this came from the Housing Production Plan, and then the Housing Plan Implementation Committee talked about it a year ago, and then it was brought to the ARB, and then it was not talked about for about 5-6 months because we focused on having a housing forum, which we held last May, where we talked about multifamily housing, we talked about various opportunities, we had the housing forum. And then we were actually going to continue that with an accessory dwelling unit forum, but ended up not doing that. So then when the Housing Plan Implementation Committee actually had about 4 new members come on board, we had our first meeting more recently, and then have been able to just at the last meeting pick this up, where actually everybody but one of the members who's here voted to endorse this proposal with, they had actually some suggested changes to it, but that's what happened in terms of the Housing Plan Implementation Committee. So it didn't come from, these other consulting, the consultant, MAPC, or the engagement that we have with CHAPA. This did not come out of that process at all. So just to clarify that one thing. So actually
Could I ask you just a
you
really
could ask me a question,
really
sure.
quick question
Yep.
about that? So if the Housing Plan Implementation Committee has pretty much endorsed this,
Yep.
and the Residential Study Group has voted no action on this, whose input carries
So-
the weight in terms of what the decision
ARB.
may be?
The ARB. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring all of this information to them. They asked you, of course, to review it, but the Housing Plan Implementation Committee reviewed it because it's part of what they've been doing. It's a component of the plan, so they wanted to talk about it,
Yep.
which we
Yep.
did. And then we'll bring all that information, as I said, to the ARB, and ultimately they have to have a public hearing because it's posted public hearing, and then I'm sure they'll discuss it themselves. They also have comments.
Okay.
And then I'm sure there will be some action needed. But based upon this conversation and what you're recommending, which is a reasonable potential outcome, I think that they'll weigh heavily on that because I asked you to review it.
Okay.
Can I just say one thing,
Yeah.
because I feel like I was the bad guy in or something, a little bit, but.
No, no.
But I just want to say.
on the ground.
But I also, I look forward to finding a solution to this. But I think there is one out there. It's just we
I
have to
see all
figure
your
out.
hands. I see them.
I figure
We'll let Mike talk.
how do we make that happen? I look forward to working in that.
Okay, thank you. Patricia and then Joanne.
And thank you. I don't like to contradict, and I'm really impressed by this meeting. I'm very grateful for the comments that have been made, very thoughtful. I do want to say that my concept of the involvement of the Housing Plan Implementation Committee and Janice are not quite the same. The first official meeting of the Housing Plan Implementation Committee, not the Housing Advisory Committee, which was
It was not the first meeting.
I don't want to argue, I just want to make
But
a
you're
statement.
not making a correct
The
statement, so I'm
first
going to
meeting
correct it.
was
Again,
in
I've corrected
February
it every
of
time.
2019. We never discussed this until about a week ago. That was the first time these members ever heard it. Another couple of
that's not
points.
true.
As regards to parking,
Not
with
true.
the zero parking requirement, some of these ADUs would be at very distant locations from mass transportation. And one of the arguments in favor of increased density was because those people at the increased density locations would be at public transportation. There would be a tremendous deficit of parking. There would be tremendous pressure for on-street parking if this ADU business happened because of the remote locations of many of the units that would occur. Another thing, as regards the actual use of family members being in one's property, there's no ban on putting an extra bathroom in your house, a microwave oven, putting another petition in. You have to consult with the building inspector maybe for a little bit of construction, but there is no reason not to do that for family members as it is right now. We don't need this ADU business for it. I had my sister, after a messy divorce, live with her family very comfortably for quite a long time. And my son, when he graduated from MIT, he and his girlfriend moved in for 5 years with us. Oh, it's chaperoned. It was chaperoned. They're not married. But there is no reason whatsoever that family members cannot be accommodated in housing as it exists right now, due to the vigilance of our building inspector. Thank you.
Okay, Joanne.
I'll make sure. I thought it could be helpful in any task force you put together on this. I thought, because what comes up often is there's some elderly woman who can't manage and need an ADU. So I think we ought to give a lot of thought to actually what is the situation for elderly people. And I mean, instead of knowing a case here and there, and I'd be glad to contribute to that. I'd like to say, because I think they're changing what they want, but I'd also like to add to that, friends of ours have moved in, the 82-year-old grandmother. They redid a whole floor. They have a wonderful kitchen area, and I should ask the building inspector, but as I understand it, the one thing it lacks is an oven. And at her age, she's not really going to do a lot of cooking. She could go upstairs and use their oven. And that's worked out really well for them under existing laws. And I think as she gets older, she'll not miss an oven at all, that she will need more and more care. But she's there. They completely renovated a whole floor. Everything is working well. So I think what we have to find out is actually overall, what are the housing trends? How long could, for instance, they have a family move in, how long would they need to be there? People now are moving into assisted living because it's more sociable than having the family gone all day and they're sitting there alone. So that's an area of research I think we really should look into.
Okay, all right. Why don't we move on to the meeting minutes from the last meeting? And then we can talk about the next time you want to meet. Oh, I'm sorry, Bill.
Can I
go
make
ahead.
a motion that we take a vote on this
Oh,
of non-approval?
Yeah, I think
Sure. Yeah.
You're going to make a motion?
Second?
Second?
All in favor?
This is non-approval.
Non-approval.
Non-approval at this time.
Yes.
To table the case.
Correct.
By table.
Correct.
Yeah.
We'll
Pending much further
All in
study.
favor?
Aye.
All in favor?
Beautiful.
Anybody opposed? All right, we'll provide all of this information to the ARB with a summary of the conversation, of course. Great. Yeah.
Just a little quick, getting it back to them, we're not wanting to can it, but discuss it.
Table
further.
it.
That's what we said.
Understood.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so minutes, you have them in your packet.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah.
Any changes?
I skimmed them briefly, and I didn't see a mention of, we kind of, I'm not sure that we can completely confirm that the staff report, our staff report that you guys spent so much time preparing, the residential study group, we had talked about having this called a staff report to the residential study group rather than a residential study group report to town meeting. And I wanted to see, did we indeed confirm that? My memory is that
That's
it
what
was.
we did. Yeah.
We did,
Okay,
so it will
great.
be a staff report. Okay, all right, great. Otherwise, I move to approve the minutes.
Second.
Anybody in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? We're here. Okay, next meeting date?
As soon as possible, because we have to prepare a presentation for town meeting, right?
On the design guidelines?
On the request for funding to study design guidelines. Don't we
request-
need to do
that's-
something to,
So first of all, I actually had to file it through a special town meeting. It actually didn't.
oh, so we have
for
more
whatever
time.
reason.
So we have some more time.
So we
Okay,
do have a little bit
excellent,
of time. It does.
excellent.
It doesn't have a hearing yet with the finance committee or anything like that.
Excellent,
I'm
okay.
assuming it will.
Okay.
And then on the articles that are going to the ARB,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if there's any preparation that you want to do there or what
I
you
do.
want to
Can
do.
I have a
Yeah.
comment
Yeah.
about that? We filed 3 articles on behalf of the group. Adding the tree bylaw, protected trees, notification to the Good Neighbor Agreement, the driveway slope. I feel very confident on speaking about those 2.
Do you want to go to the
And
meeting
I want to
talk
go
about them?
to the meeting and talk about them, and I would even be willing to talk about them at town meeting. On the other hand, I tried to explain to someone the ceiling height differential, and as the words were coming out of my mouth, I realized that I did not have it in a
tough
way
one.
that was
That's a
explainable. So I would either like somebody else to do that other than me, or I would like building department to write me a paragraph that explains that I can read or become more familiar with. Because the person had no idea what I was saying, and I was trying my best, and I thought I got it, but
Whichever you want. It's actually one of the easier sections of the bylaw, just that people
yeah.
don't hear it that way.
And the consequences and what the measuring differences, and maybe you
One-
guys
one of
could
us-
write me a
one of us
paragraph,
knows.
or we could work on that together to make it so that it's understandable. Okay.
And those hearings are scheduled for the 25th.
The
right?
25th, got it?
They're all on the 25th.
Okay.
And then the hearing on the tree, I think that was moved, and then it happened.
It happened, and I talked with Doug Heim about
And
that.
everything was fine.
And everything was fine, and
Yeah.
I was gonna go, but then Doug said, don't go, because
Because
he had it.
that's a town bylaw.
Yep.
All right.
That's good.
Yes.
Jenny, whatever happened to the town survey on the Good Neighbor Law? Is that supposed to be presented to town meeting?
No, it's not necessarily to town meeting, no, but we are still in the midst of collecting the responses and finalizing everything, I think, at this
Yeah.
point, right? It closed?
It closed on Friday, March 1st. So Kelly, the senior planner in the department, is working on analyzing the results.
And then we said that we were actually going to, well, first of all, this group will talk about the results. And then we said that we would incorporate them into the report in some way. And that's all that we got
When you
to.
do schedule for discussion in the group, I'd like to make a short presentation of my own parallel study on that.
Okay.
With regard to the design guidelines, if you get funding approval,
Yeah.
when would you begin that activity?
Well, it'd be like a fiscal year thing, so July 1st, technically,
Okay.
but all
So-
that would happen first would be
Someone in town would then write a scope of
the
work.
scope of work, right?
And who or what group would be responsible for
So I
that?
think the way that it's written in that request is that the residential study group and others would be participating in a process to develop to oversee that process
So
essentially.
if someone wanted to have input to that scope of work
Yeah.
and what the ultimate work products would be coming out of it, we would then forward our comments to this group.
Probably to my department,
your
actually, so
department.
yeah.
Okay.
To come.
Yes, but
Yeah,
I have.
gotta get through
I have interest in it
the
because
request.
that was one of the original intents in my
Yeah.
mind, that this group was formed. And I'm glad to see that there's activity that's now gonna proceed, hopefully, in
Okay.
this direction. Because a few years ago, when we presented zoning changes, and most of them were rejected, they were out of concern for preserving the character and quality of life in the R0, R1 neighborhoods because of tear downs and all the variety of stuff that goes with them. And over the last few years, I've noticed a lot of work being done out of the RSG, and some of it's very good, but I hadn't heard a lot of discussion about what I believe was the original intent of this group. And I really would like to see that start, and I'd be happy to try to contribute whatever thoughts I might have.
Okay, thank you.
As minimal as those may be, right?
As minimal as they may be. Right.
All right, what do you want to do in terms of a next meeting, just so we can get that on the books?
What do you say?
I'm around.
Want to throw some dates out, Erin?
Yeah, let me pull up your calendar
Okay.
as well. Sorry, I have to go into the email system.
You could send around
While
some
we're here.
potential dates, but
Looks like that date. So I'm looking at next week, and I wouldn't be able to post in time. Sorry, so it'd have to be mid next week to start. It looks like the afternoon of the 13th potentially could work.
like what time?
I won't be here that day.
Okay.
That's the day I'm out.
Oh, that's correct.
But
How about the next week?
What about the next week?
Yep. Sorry, online email system is not the most user friendly.
Zippy.
So. So the morning of March 22nd looks like it would work. That's a Friday.
March 22nd.
It's a Friday.
That's fine by me.
We can do our usual 8:30.
8:30. I think that's better.
Does that sound?
That works for me.
Okay, good. All right.
What was the date again? Sorry.
March the 22nd at 8:30.
Friday at 8:30.
All right, great. Thank you. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Steve. Enjoy.
Thanks.
Enjoy.
22nd.
Talk to you later.
Okay.
It's not early for some people.
Hello. I got my options.